Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new session of Room for Discussion. Nearly half a year ago, a climate agreement was signed during COP21 in Paris in December. A climate agreement, an historical agreement, but critics argue this is not enough. This is not enough to protect the environment, from ecocides happening, and to protect the Earth from keeping below 2 degrees. So what needs to be done if an historical climate agreement is not enough? We've got 2 experts on law today who propose innovative initiatives to come up with new ideas, new solutions, and use law as a means to solve these challenges like climate change and ecocide. First of all, is Polly Higgins, a Scottish former barrister and now international environmental lawyer, and is often called the Earth's Liar. She became known in the Netherlands after Tegenlicht backlight documentary about her, and she is fighting or proposing an ecocide law. Next to her will be Professor Jaap Spier, who has been a professor in tort law for over 25 years and is also one of the co-initiators of the Oslo Principles, guiding principles for states to act more sufficiently and address climate change. But we'll hear a lot more about them from them. Please feel free to join the discussion by asking questions. Amrit has the microphone, or Twitter along using hashtag RFD. But now please give a warm hand for Polly Higgins and Jaap Spier. Please take a seat.
There we go. Ms. Higgins, Mrs. Spier, welcome on my behalf as well. It's great to have you here. It's not the first time we spoke to each other. We also spoke to each other in the beginning of COP21. And now COP21 has passed, and you both are here to present your solutions to the problem of climate change. Ms. Higgins, to start with you, before the Earth became your one and only client, you were a practicing barrister in London, and now people are calling you the Earth's lawyer. How come?
A strange thing happened when I was a barrister. I found myself in court one day, looking out of the window and thinking, it's not just my client that I was representing in court that's been harmed, so is the Earth. And I know now that these moments are sometimes called critical choice points in our lives, where you're given an opportunity to take another route. And in a way, that's precisely what I did. I actually stepped out of that courtroom and had made a fundamental decision. I asked a really big question. I said, how do we create a legal duty of care for the Earth? And I thought I'd give myself a year out to answer that question. And that was now nearly 12 years ago, so I'm still on my year out, if you like.
And how did your colleagues respond to your career change or your thoughts?
Well, initially, my lawyer friends thought I was mad. And they said, this is ridiculous, the Earth can't have rights, we can't create a legal duty of care for the Earth. And I said, well, why not? I mean, at the end of the day, we actually give personhood to represent companies in court. Why can't we do the same for the Earth? But actually my thinking progressed, and I realised that rights alone in isolation is not enough. It's the enforcement, it's the duties and the obligations. It's like 2 sides of a coin. One side you have rights, but the other side you have the duties and obligations. And for me this was just a natural expansion of our cycle of concern. Not just human-to-human engagement, but human to non-human engagement. What are our duties and responsibilities to the wider Earth community? That can include humans, but it also extends beyond just human engagement.
And that was when you decided to become the Earth's lawyer.
Well, I have to say, I didn't decide. I think other people have decided that.
Who came up with the name, by the way?
I don't know. It just kept on popping up everywhere.
Okay, cool.
Mr. Spier, you've been a professor in tort law for numerous years, and now actually most recently You've been appointed with the honorary chair here at the UFAP, Professor of Global Challenges and Climate Change. First of all, congratulations. But second, since when and why did climate change involve your academic work combining with Torgla?
First, my main job is the Supreme Court, still, until the 1st of September. Well, at some stage I came to understand that the daily nitty-gritty I have to handle is less important than the global challenges. So I started working on sustainability issues, predominantly climate change. Part of the story is because I was and am a bit frustrated about the debate. The debate is very much along the lines, well, these are huge challenges, a lot must be done. Well, that's true.
The debate about climate change.
Well, and other sustainability issues. Well, a lot must be done, but that doesn't bring us anywhere. We must be much more concrete what must be done by whom and why. And that's what I have been trying together with many others to figure out what are the legal obligations of the important players.
And that's what has resulted in the Oslo Principles. The Oslo Principles, which have been launched roughly a year ago, when I believe the Guardian article I read. Could you briefly explain what the Oslo Principles are stating?
I'll try. First, you have to figure out on the basis of the precautionary principle what the acceptable greenhouse gas emissions are in a specific year. Then you can figure out what the emission rights are of each global citizen, the per capita emissions. Once you know that, you have to multiply that by the number of inhabitants of a specific country. Then you have learned the acceptable emissions of a specific country in a given year. Well, in many countries in this part of the world, the emissions are considerably higher. Well, that means that those countries have to reduce their emissions that are above the acceptable as soon as possible. Could go into more detail, but that would be very unfair to Polly. There are a few additional obligations. Reductions that can be achieved at no cost have to be put in place. That sounds innocent, it's certainly not. It means, for example, that people, enterprises, schools and so on and so forth have to lower heating, have to reduce the use of air conditioning and so on and so forth. That may sound ridiculous for many of you. We believe it's not. Please bear in mind that over 2 or 3 billion people don't have any heating or air conditioning at all. Many of them even don't have access to water, let alone clean water. And well, we mapped a few more obligations, and if you are interested, happy to go into more detail.
Right, we'll go into more detail later. So this clear set of principal obligations for states is the starting point. We spoke each other as well during COP21 in December in Paris. And we also talked about what were your thoughts on the climate agreement. And you answered that you were rather pessimistic about the effects, about the consequences of the agreement, even though it's called an historical agreement. Are you still pessimistic about the result?
Well, a lot more has been achieved than I would believe that would happen.
For example?
Well, there are at least some fairly bold and perhaps even enforceable obligations. That said, countries could not agree on the reductions that have to be achieved by the specific countries, and that is really a shortcoming.
Are you as well pessimistic about the climate agreement?
On one side, it's not so much pessimism. I think maybe more a sense of despair that it doesn't go nearly far enough. But on the other side, I can see that there is, it's galvanized people around actually recognizing that something has to be done. For me, it doesn't go nearly far enough.
So what is still lacking then in the agreement?
The key thing that's really lacking there is provision for those who are most adversely impacted by climate change. Small island developing states, climate vulnerable states. The key provision that was really going to give assistance there was the climate adaptation, climate displacement coordination facility, which basically means migration with dignity. And that was removed 3 weeks before Paris actually occurred back in December, without any of those small island developing states being in those meetings. That was their lifeline, if you like, and that was cut. What do you do when you go underwater? You know, at the end of the day, creating jobs to measure greenhouse gas emissions from your sinking island is irrelevant when you're looking at an existential humanitarian crisis. What do? Do you just put them on boats and hope everyone will be fine and pray with your fingers crossed that some other country will take them in? And then what do? Do we just put people in camps, internment camps? I mean, the biggest one we have so far only houses 1 million in Colombia, and people have been living there for 20 years. They're born and they die there, surrounded by big walls and big fences with barbed wire. But what do you do when you have 150 million displaced people from small island developing states? That's a lot of people.
But so that's a small part of the agreement which has been left out eventually.
Yeah.
A big criticism of the agreement is also that the obligations or the pledges which have been made by specific countries are not legally binding. Is that something you try to address as well, Mr. Spier?
Well, it's open to debate whether the pledges, the concrete pledges, are or are not legally binding. But what we don't have are concrete reduction obligations, and that's what we really need.
Because what at the moment are those pledges? They're not reduction agreements?
Well, there are pledges that they have to achieve ever higher reductions in the years to come, that they have, and that in itself is quite something. That said, well, the pledges made so far are significantly insufficient.
True.
Well, if we would stick to those pledges, we will have an increase of global temperature by 2.7 degrees or more. And well, the countries are telling us that towards the upper limit, and that our goal should be 1.5. Well, that means that a lot more must be done. And the willingness to get there seems to be absent.
So the pledges are not enough, and politics seems to fail on this part. Mrs. Higgins, do you think law could offer a solution?
Yeah, very much so. In fact, Jaap and I have been talking about this before stepping on stage. Sometimes where political will fails, the rule of law can prevail. And more lawyers are now coming together and saying something more has to be done here. And this is where lots of different aspects and different ways of looking at this become very important. And what you're working on, Jaap, is part of that. What I'm working on that is part of that. And as we were both agreeing, there's a kind of larger jigsaw puzzle here. And indeed, here the Urgenda case is very important. That was something that sent out a very powerful message right across the world. And that story is not over yet, of course. Where that will go and what will happen next is going to be very interesting. But also in the United States, a number of civil litigations have been brought, climate cases against the government, the American government, by youths in different states, and 2 of them now have gotten past the first hurdle. A lot of them were thrown out of court, but 2 are now starting to get a ball rolling. So there's something happening here. There's an increase in engagement around these issues from a legal perspective.
But then on what basis are those cases grounded? For example, in the US?
Oh, this is based on the atmospheric trust principles that another lawyer, Professor Mimswood from Oregon, has proposed. So in a way, you're looking at emergent law that's being tested through the courts there. And what is also very exciting is that it's not just going through the legal domain, but it's going through the public arena. And I think this is very important. You know, it's youths that are bringing this case, so that there is a mainstream media engagement around this, recognising that actually, you know, we have duties and responsibilities for young people as they're growing up and through this. Where are they going to be in 2020? Where are they going to be in 2050? You know, what about their children's children? So this is a legacy issue, not just for the here and now, but for future generations as well. And it allows us to actually engage with a far more considered level of engagement and discourse around these issues that is absolutely critical at this point in time.
So more and more people from the legal department are speaking up and offering solutions. Let's talk a little bit more about the solution you are proposing, an ecocide law.
Yeah.
What is it exactly?
What I've proposed is that we criminalise mass damage and destruction, extensive damage, destruction to a loss of ecosystems. And the parameters to establish whether or not something is an ecocide are the parameters that have already been put in place under the Environmental Modification Convention that sets out a size, duration, impact test, a disjunctive, what's called a disjunctive test, an either-or test. And I say that not only should that apply during wartime, but it should also apply during peacetime. So really I'm dealing with a crime against peace here, as it's known, but also this is about state criminality and corporate crime. You know, what is it? What are the decisions that are made at the very top end that can lead, cause, or aid and abet significant harm being caused through dangerous industrial activity, human-caused activity? But there's a second type of activity as well, a second type of ecocide, and that's naturally occurring ecocide, which for climate purposes is very important. Now, of course, you can't prosecute Shell or BP for rising sea levels. Too tenuous a connection there. You can actually, under ecocide law, prosecute them for causing significant harm on that territory, and amongst other things, you may be looking at the evidence of the harm that's been contributed to the atmosphere through excess greenhouse gas emissions, amongst other forms of harm that's been caused through extractive processes, or as we were discussing earlier, the burning of those fossil fuels. But there is another aspect there, and that's about imposing a mandatory duty of care on states to give assistance to those who are at the front line of climate change, the naturally occurring ecocide, the rising sea levels, the tsunamis, the typhoons. I was talking to one climate negotiator in Bonn last year who was telling me that they've had 10 typhoons in a year, when usually they have one typhoon in 10 years. And you can imagine how that significantly adversely impacts not just on how they live their lives, but also how you have to rebuild houses. This affects their economy. How do they gain international assistance on this? At the moment it's voluntary. You know, you have a bit of emergency assistance for 3 weeks of a news story and then it's gone. But often for those people living in that country, this kind of wiped out ways of lives, their livelihoods.
So ecocide law could help here.
Yeah.
My question was though, we have so many environmental laws already. We have the pollution control laws, forestry laws, many laws which are there to protect our environment. Why do you think an extra law would make the difference?
Yeah. I don't think it's actually just a matter of an extra law here. One of the things that I recognised as a practicing lawyer was that existing laws for the environment were no longer fit for purpose. And that's clearly the case because we're in a worse position, not a better position. So it's not so much just to add on an extra law just like the other ones. It's about rethinking this from a very different perspective. And instead of little laws here that deal with that little aspect and that little aspect through civil litigation, which often causes huge problems where an individual or a community neither have the financial wherewithal or the legal assistance to take a case against a big transnational corporation who have a lot of money and a lot of legal assistance to run these cases, and often run them many decades through the courts, that actually by imposing a legal duty of care on the state to act on the citizens' behalf and the communities that are adversely impacted, then what you're doing is you're adding to the criminality of it. And we get to a certain stage where we say enough, no more, and we criminalise it.
How can an ecocide be criminalized? First of all, what again is, for example, an example of what you call an ecocide?
Okay, so to give an example, for instance, if we look at the Amazon, so we're seeing the Amazon being destroyed at a vast rate. Allegedly, a football field every minute is being destroyed there. Now, you can fly over that. You can go onto Google Earth and Google the Amazon. It stretches over 5 different countries, and you can see what's already been destroyed there. You can look at that and you can say, does that constitute an ecocide? Well, arguably, under the parameters of size, duration, or impact, yes, it definitely does.
But that's already illegal, right? I mean, illegal
It's not a
forestry
crime.
laws already exist, and they're trying to fight it.
Depends on which country you're in, and it depends on which laws you're applying and whether or not it's civil litigation. And it also depends on whether or not that country is willing to take action on behalf of its citizens. If it isn't in place as a crime, then there's no onus on that state to do that. So then you have to rely on, as your Amazonian tribe, to take the litigation yourself through civil courts. And that can be hugely problematical. I mean, if you look at, for instance, there has been a case that was brought by Pablo Fajardes, who had to train himself up as a lawyer to do this in the Amazon against Texaco Chevron. That case took 13 years to go through the civil courts in Ecuador. Now, there was eventually a finding against Texaco Chevron, but you know what? They're appealing it through the American courts. No payouts have ever been made. People have actually lived and died through the duration of that case. The land that's been destroyed through the pollution in the Amazon has never been remediated.
So it could be illegal already, like illegal foresting,
Yeah.
but you're arguing by making it a criminal international crime, it could be easier to, well, hold these people or enterprises accountable?
Yes, what you're dealing with here is criminality rather than civil litigation. Criminal laws, you bring a prosecution, or rather the state brings the prosecution on your behalf. And that's very important here, because actually you've got the support of the state to help you and your community prevent the harm, and when there is harm, to stop it from continuing. And that's absolutely crucial here, because this is how states then represent the interests of their citizens. At the moment, that doesn't exist. And so Pablo Fajardes and those tribes that had their land destroyed and ended up sick and had their waterways polluted, and now they can no longer eat from them. They can't go down that avenue just now.
And aren't there any states who commit ecocides themselves?
Well, if you look at what's happening, for instance, in America, I've spent time in America, in Montana and northern Dakota, where there are vast tracts of land that have been fracked, for instance. Huge territories, hundreds and hundreds of kilometres, driving through these lands that have been vastly destroyed. Now, for instance, in the UK, our government wants to go ahead with fracking. I've personally witnessed the extreme damage and destruction it does, not just to the land, but to the communities who live there as well. The cultural ecocide, if you will, that happens, the implosion of their way of lives.
But how then can a state sort of defend or sue itself for these ecocides?
Okay, so you're not suing. Criminal law is about prosecutions. So what happens is the state then has a duty to bring a prosecution to stop that company that's causing the ecocide. But in fact, what happens is, in essence, it becomes a preemptive law, because the state will no longer want to sign off on dangerous industrial activity that could then give rise to an ecocide.
And fracking would automatically be an ecocide?
If you look at it in terms of the cumulative impact, then there's an argument to say that yes, this is an ecocide, without a doubt. I'm not an expert on fracking, I can only talk from my own direct experience of it. But what ecocide law does do is it actually provides a forum within a legal courtroom, a context upon which evidence can be brought into a court of law to examine whether or not it is in fact an ecocide and therefore has to stop.
Mr. Spier, your Oslo Principles are built on existing law. What are your thoughts of creating a new law? Is this realistic?
Well, I don't know. I would be surprised, to be honest.
Why?
Why would countries accept this kind of criminal law? It's very much to the detriment of themselves and their enterprises.
So it's not in their interest?
Not in their short-term interest.
Would you agree?
Well, I think it depends on what your interests are. If your interests are to continue on with dangerous industrial activity, of course it's not. You're not going to benefit from it. But if your interests are to move to a greener economy, if your interests are to actually really bring forward renewable energy in a big way, if your interests are to ensure the health and well-being of your citizens and future generations, then of course it's in your interest. So it depends where your interests are aligned in the first place. You know, and that's what's very important here. Where are political interests actually aligned at this point in time? And if they're not aligned with what ultimately is going to create a better world, then what are we doing? You know, and that's what's very interesting here. I mean, you know, I share your pessimism about the Western world's politics. But it's not just the Western world that actually has a say in this law being put in place, and that's also very important here.
But now then, concretely, in the documentary series, we see you talk with small island state representatives, so they can make an amendment on the Rome Statute and actually initialize this ecocide law. So are they in favor of imposing such ecocide law?
Some of them are giving it good consideration. Where that goes...
Why wouldn't they automatically be in favor if you say this is in their pure interest?
You know,
perhaps you have to make a distinction between politicians and the country. Their interests are not necessarily the same.
Right. Please elaborate.
Well, the small island states belong to the major emitters per capita of this world. And that's apparently allowed by politicians, so it's not necessarily in their best interest to criminalize this. Well, the country as a whole, the citizens, will become the victims. It's very much the interest of the citizens to criminalize this.
So maybe don't propose it to the states. Mrs. Higgins, you have proposed a draft of ecocide law to the United Nations in 2010. How was it received at the United Nations?
You know, The Guardian got in touch a week later and they wanted commentary, and in fact they even got in touch with the United Nations Law Commission, and their response was, we have no mandate to give comment on this, which I think was a way of just saying, we don't know what to say. So, you know, however, saying that, The Guardian went very big on this, and actually that gave it huge coverage at the time, which was absolutely fantastic. And as a result, you know, we're 6 years on, there's been a huge amount of engagement around this, from a whole number of different avenues. And I've just recently come back from the United States, where I was invited into the United Nations to give a number of briefing meetings there. So, you know, opinions shift over time as well. What seemed absolutely radical at the outset, and nobody was prepared to even dare give comment on it, to the point that now there are a number of lawyers around the world willing to, you know, engage in this, and some of them actually wanting to really take this further forward. And not just lawyers, but various countries are engaging on this as well, and citizen engagement. We have something shifting here. You know, there's an emergence of certainly an appetite for something more. You know, when I was in America a few weeks ago, there was one phrase that came up all the time. You know, people saying, we're looking for more extreme measures. And we have an extreme situation here. They kept on comparing it to sport. You know, we can play table tennis and ping pong back and forth with climate negotiations while everything sinks around us. Or we can actually go for the extreme sports, and maybe that's what it's about. You know, here we are on the High Line as a small island state, and we're kind of wobbling, and there's no net to catch us when we fall off, and maybe it requires more extreme and radical solutions, and Ecocide law could be part of that.
So let's have a look how that would then work in practice. In one of the articles on your website, I read that the oil depletion in the Niger Delta, where Shell is one of the main responsibles for, would be an ecocide as well. Is that right?
So this was the Guardian that I mentioned earlier back in 2010. They identified 10 key, what they saw as the kind of largest ecocides that could be possibly ecocides in the world. And indeed gave that as an example in the Amazon and the Athabasca tar sands.
Right.
I'm not an expert. I'm just the lawyer that's providing. It could be. It could be an example.
Okay,
I'm not saying that it definitively is, because actually that will require evidence brought into a court of law so that we can test that.
Okay, so but let's just for the idea have a look at. Let's take that as an example.
Yeah.
Let's say ecocide law would exist. You would probably argue then there wouldn't probably have been any spill. But let's say there would, let's say there was an enormous environmental degradation over there. What would happen to Shell concretely if ecocide law would exist?
Okay, so in fact, we road tested this idea in 2011, where we held a mock ecocide trial in our UK Supreme Court. So the prosecutor, the prosecuting authority then have to make a decision, who is it they're going to prosecute. So you're looking at who are the major companies in that area that are causing the ecocide, and then it's a decision as to whom you're prosecuting. Is it the CEO, or the CEO of the directors? Are you looking also at maybe a minister, if they've signed off on a given project, a minister for energy? You could be even looking at a head of state under international criminal law. So there are decisions to be made at a prosecuting authority level. When we road tested it as a mock ecocide trial, we just chose to prosecute CEOs, partly because we only had a day to road test this.
Yeah, so
but you have a number of avenues that you can look at.
So Ben Burden needs to show up to court then, in this case.
Shell CEO.
Well, this is again, you know, if someone was to fail to turn up to court, then you can issue a warrant for their arrest. You know, so there are mechanisms already in place for this. When, just as, you know, as if you're prosecuting someone for theft, for instance.
And what kind of penalties do we need to think of?
Yeah, we were touched on this a little bit earlier, and one of the things we had to do for the mock ecocide trial was we suddenly realised we have to draft an ecocide act. It's one thing to have this in place as an international law, but how would that look like when it's transposed into national legislation? So a number of lawyers came together and we drafted kind of the backbone of what an ecocide act, the key provisions would be. And it allowed us to also really have a very constructive dialogue around the idea of restorative justice, going beyond just, you know, okay, let's put someone in jail, going beyond a fine, because often fines come too little too late. And actually, sometimes for communities that are most adversely impacted, it's actually about how do you bring back, remediate the land, remediate the way of life, restore that to what it once was. And of course, that needn't necessarily happen overnight. That can sometimes, you know, if you're taking out vast tracts of the Amazon, how long did it take to put that there? You know, a long time. So, but the conscious intent to make good the harm, and that was really important.
Before we talk a bit more about the Oslo Principles as well, are there any questions on ecocide law here at the front and then later at the back?
No.
Okay, so, alright. let's say somebody would commit a crime and they would have to pay. Who would they pay to, and then what institutions would use that money to restore environment, for example?
Okay, so this is touching on the earlier aspect. With criminal law, it's not necessarily always a fine. Civil litigation, yes, you're dealing with fines and payouts, but criminal law, so for instance, you end up getting mugged or assaulted. It's not necessarily that a fine is paid there. It may well be that that individual has to undertake some form of community service, or they may go to prison. So rather than it being a fine, the proposals that were actually drafted into the Ecocide Act was the court would have the opportunity to put in place various orders to ensure that that company that has caused the harm then has to make good the harm, or ensure that they remediate the polluted water, clean up whatever land has been harmed in whatever way, and very specific orders. And indeed, we do this in any event in criminal courts in some respects already, where specific orders are put in place. Family law courts are a very dynamic area where specific orders can be drafted up and can actually be brought together over heads of agreement, and then the court agrees it. And indeed, what we did with our mock Ecocide trial was we adjourned it off for sentencing, and we invited both the CEOs that were being prosecuted to enter into a restorative justice hearing. One of them refused. He said, absolutely no way, I don't take responsibility for this, I'm going to be appealing this. But the other one said yes, and that was a really dynamic process, and we had one of our top mediators in the UK who facilitated the process, and we brought to the table various people who represented various interests of parties who'd been harmed. So rather than just working out how you divvy up the money, you're actually bringing the parties to the table. So someone represented the adverse impact on the birds. Now that sounds silly, but actually, of course, we have NGOs and organisations that represent bird interests who have been adversely impacted. So, speaking as a bird expert, someone could come to the table and say, well, this is the adverse impact for the birds, and this is what would be required to remediate that land to allow those birds who migrate and normally land on those wetlands to do that again. We had someone else representing the indigenous communities. We actually had an indigenous leader who was there as well. So you end up with a far more complex process of decision making, but it's far fairer.
So this is how Ecocide law would work, or at least a sneak peek of it?
Yeah, it could. I mean, what we're doing is we're offering a way and showing a way of how this can be applied. Mm-hmm. And in a way, it's the best case scenario. I'm not interested in doing things out of compromise. I'm interested in how we can really aspire to a better world. And I genuinely believe in a better world. And I know, Jaap, that you believe in a better world because it's even written on the front of your book.
Yeah, let's talk about your approach of the problem.
About me, I first worthwhile. First, I really admire your initiative, and we have been talking about this for 1 hour and a half this morning. I think that it would be useful to make it more concrete. People, governments, enterprises should know what they have to do. And it would be very helpful if that would be a little bit more clear. That said, it's an admirable initiative.
Great to hear. Are the Oslo Principles doing what you just said now, making it clearer for governments and individuals what they need to do?
Individuals, no, because they are not mentioned. Governments, yes, at least that's what we have tried.
Mm-hmm. And when was the idea of the Oslo Principles born?
A couple of years ago.
And was it also in Oslo, where you got the names from?
Geneva.
And how did you end up with the name Oslo Principles?
Last meeting.
Okay, so it could have been Stockholm Principles as well.
Yes.
Doesn't matter. All right. Then the Oslo Principles, as we mentioned before, are based around existing legal obligations.
Our interpretation of the law as it stands.
Okay, so that's pretty important. Around what interpretation and what kinds of law are these principles based?
Well, the traditional approach is you should look at either human rights law or international law or domestic law, and well, that is very useful in most instances, but it's not sufficiently helpful if you are talking about the global challenges. And that is the reason why we have tried to look at all those parts of the law and to amalgamate them. Only international law, only human rights law, only the law of delict is probably insufficient. But a lot can be gained to bring all that together, and that's what we have tried.
And what is eventually the purpose of the Oslo Principles? What do states need to do with these principles? Does the Prime Minister have it at his desk and have a look, am I complying to the principles?
Now, they just have to comply, that's all.
And then what concretely, let's take the Netherlands. What should the Netherlands do according to the principles that you and the other jurists have founded?
Well, to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to the extent they are above the permissible level. And that's quite something.
Now, during the COP21 there was also a lot of discussions going on about who should take the lead, who is responsible for the climate change, and especially there was debate going on between less developed countries and developed countries. The less developed countries blamed the developed countries for being responsible or main responsible for the climate change. And when I'm reading your Oslo Principles, clause number 15, it stated, least developed countries do not have legal obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at their own expense.
Mm-hmm.
Does this mean that you are arguing that developed countries are responsible for also helping least developed countries to make this transition?
In our view, the burden it falls on the developed countries, and perhaps a few developing countries, arguably more developing countries than we had in mind. And if poor countries can only comply with the obligations of the Oslo Principles, then the financial burden has to be borne by the rich countries. That goes, for example, if poor countries would have to borrow money to reduce their emissions, whereas the cost will pay back at some time.
And what countries are we talking then? Which countries would pay for less developed countries?
Well, for practical purposes, the Western world, Europe.
So Europe.
No, North America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few more countries, yes.
Eventually, that is also something which has been already agreed upon in the climate agreement, right? There's going to be a fund on which developing countries can use of, and developed countries will actually already provide, I think it's 100 billion for these least developed countries.
Well, that's perhaps a slightly different story. That is largely about adaptation, and that's really something different. The Oslo Principles are not about adaptation, they're only about mitigation, to reduce emissions, that's it. We don't express a view on adaptation, we don't express a view on compensation.
So, which countries, are there already any countries who support the Oslo Principles?
Well, probably the poor countries, they don't have obligations.
And are you talking with developed countries also?
No.
So, no.
No.
Why not?
We try to avoid to enter into political debates. We are a group of academics, senior judges, and we try to be independent, and we are very keen to avoid criticism that we are biased, that we are singing the song of specific players.
But still, you mentioned interpreting the law in a certain way. And the fact that least developed countries have no legal obligations with regards to emission reduction, isn't that some sort of biased interpretation?
Why?
On what basis is the argument grounded?
Well, the argument I already mentioned, we have tried to figure out what is an acceptable level of emissions of a specific country. All poor countries have emissions that are considerably less, hence they don't have obligations.
Right.
That's part of the formula.
And then let's talk a bit more about the also work in practice. For example, the Oslo Principles have been quoted in the Dutch climate case, which have been mentioned before by you, Ms. Higgins. Urgenda has successfully won the climate case against the Dutch government, and now the Dutch government has the legal obligation to reduce its emissions by 25% in 2020, I think. Was that a great success for you and the group of jurists?
First, I'm not in a position to talk about the agenda case, as you may appreciate. I'm still a member of the Supreme Court. And the case is pending on appeal.
Right.
That said, to the best of my knowledge, the court did not quote the Oslo Principles.
Did not quote.
Did not quote the Oslo Principles.
Right, but would that be a form of using the Oslo Principles, that it would be used in court cases?
Of course.
Because is that the ultimate purpose as well?
It's one of the purposes.
And is then not a different purpose that it's not just mentioned in courts, but that it's just automatically taken on by policymakers?
Well, we hope so. A bit realistic, I realize, but at least we hope that there are politicians willing to come on board without litigation. But a lot more can be done. It will foster the academic debate. It will be an underpinning for many actions by NGOs. Major investors may come on board and may put pressure on states and enterprises to do a better job. So, well, litigation is only part of the story, but a lot more can be achieved even without litigation, at least if we hope so.
Ms. Higgins, what were your first thoughts on the Oslo Principles, and do you see a connection with Ecocide law? Is it completely different and useless?
Oh, this definitely, no. This is definitely very important. And my first response to this was fantastic. We've got a team of top legal brains, legal eagles here, really putting their brains to thinking, how can we actually create some form of mechanism to take forward accountability with regards to greenhouse gas emissions. And this is really, really important. There's no one solution here. Of course, we know this. It's like little parts of the jigsaw puzzle. And the Oslo Principles, actually, I was saying this earlier, there's a symbiosis between the ideas of Ecocide law and the Oslo Principles. Each benefits from the other. Because actually we're singing from the same song sheet here. We're recognizing that there has to be accountability and responsibility taken for what is playing out here. Whether or not you look at it specifically from greenhouse gas emissions, whether or not you're looking at it from a climate change context, whether or not you're looking at it through an Ecocide law lens. It all comes to actually this kind of golden thread that runs through it, the recognition of, which goes back to my first question to myself, how do we create a legal duty of care for the earth?
So there's no ultimate solution to the problem, also not from the legal aspect. Do you think there will be a solution fast enough before we reach, well, a point of no return?
Well, you know, I'm not a futurologist, but the way I see it is, I'm going to give it my best shot in my lifetime. You know, this is something that's worthwhile actually championing. And it's not going to just be me. There are many other lawyers coming forward. You know, here I am, a great honor to be sitting beside another great earth lawyer. As far as I'm concerned, you are an earth lawyer, because you're putting your great brain to see what can be done here. And you guys are going to benefit because he's coming here in September. And it will take many of you students as well. You know, this is an exciting time to engage with these issues. You have a choice in life to step up and participate and engage with the creation of laws that will help with the earth to make it a better world. Or you can just sit back and say, oh, well, it's too late. But if we're living and breathing, then it can never be too late.
I'm just wondering, I hear two very convincing initiatives. But first you, Ms. Higgins, who or what is stopping you, or what is stopping this initiative?
I don't think anything's stopping it. What's hindering it is the lack of political will in the Western world. But you know, I wonder whether or not this is also about how we reframe the way we engage with law. Maybe it's about citizens engaging with law as well and finding about how they can start to really participate in the engagement of what new laws are put in place.
So what would you say to the young people sitting here? How can they participate more?
Well, you know, we're living through fast-changing times, and engaging with law through that constructive lens of asking big questions of our time. There are huge challenges here, so it requires huge, responses to it. But at a very practical level, come on board and be part of the wider team around Ecocide law. There's a great team here already in the Netherlands, and Katie, who's sitting at the front here. Katie, can you put your hand up, please? There we go. Come and talk to Katie and find out more about how you can engage. This is a key country. The International Criminal Court is based here in The Hague. So the Netherlands has a very important role, and there's already some engagement within your government, which is really fantastic.
Great. On that note, we have several questions in the audience. The man in front. Yeah. See? Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. I want to introduce a kind of holistic point of view. I see the Ecocide law, there's a big tension with the economic development. And you see I think it's quite opposed to the paradigms of economic growth. And if I try to look how this field of powers, tensions field will develop, I can't imagine that it will develop separately. So I expect that if Ecocide will become
Criminalized?
Sorry?
Criminalized?
Now effective, then there has to be also some kind of development on the economical side. So I can't imagine that some country or the whole world will adapt Ecocide without adapting the economical system at the same time, because it's too disruptive for the whole societal system.
What are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree. And this is the interesting thing. Ecocide law will have huge implications for our economies and our development processes. Think of it this way. You have a law of Ecocide in place. What decisions are you going to be making in government as to whether or not you prioritise by law renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuel? So where are you going to go with that? What are you going to prefer to prioritise? Never mind, what are you going to have to by law prioritise? So different decisions will be made. Different decisions will be made in the boardroom. You'll suddenly start asking the questions. First and foremost, if we continue with, for instance, this fracking, is the cumulative impact going to be on the Netherlands? A potential Ecocide? If so, actually our financiers are not going to invest in this because this is going to be so high risk. And our shareholders would find it untenable that we would do something that could amount to a crime. So you start to ask different questions. and you start to look through a different lens. You know, at the moment, it is the legal duty of a CEO and his or her directors to put the interests of the shareholders first, which means to maximise profit. But when you have an international law of Ecocide above that, then actually what you're doing is you're superseding that number one legal duty in the boardroom. And you're saying, okay, we have to ask some preliminary questions. So it's not anti-development, it's very pro-development, but it's pro-development in the other direction, which means then you're creating, you know, a cleaner economy at the same time. Where you're making your profit, it suddenly becomes a low risk to invest in, for instance, renewable energies. So your flow of funds is going into non-harmful or significantly less harmful industrial activity as a result. And that has a huge knock-on impact economically as well.
If I may add, economic research shows that the job can be done at a very affordable price.
The job?
The economic price job can be done. It is not that expensive. It's certainly not.
But what exactly is not that expensive?
Well, the measures that have to be taken can be taken, and that is not overly expensive. Of course, it goes at a price, very rarely.
To reduce emissions,
yeah, but not only to reduce emissions, much more must be done.
Right.
That's only one of the global challenges.
Right. More questions. Keep them brief, please. We only have a couple of minutes. Here at the front first, and then.
Thank you. I have a question about the next step, because I admire your work very much, and we are in a progress way. What will be the next step? I think from climate justice, we have to go to footprint justice, because also the land is not divided very fair. We have the calculations now, it's the footprint model, and I have my question, do you know of initiatives of going to this next step to discuss not only the climate claims or the CO2 emissions division, but also the land, the resources, because the Dutch use 4 times more than a fair share. So we need a fairer share legal case. Do you know of any initiatives about this?
Thank you. First, some more questions, and then we'll ask them at the back. And here in the middle.
No? Oh yeah, you will. Yeah. What I find very puzzling at this very moment is what will be the effect in case TTIP will get through? What will be the case if CETA will get through? What is the role of the European Union within this whole situation? And is Brexit, in case Brexit gets its way?
Maybe you can
this
give us one question.
This is more or less the same thing, because TTIP, CETA, and the European Union, actually they act together. So you can get rid of TTIP and CETA, but tomorrow you will have TTOP or TTAP, it doesn't matter. So that's the question, and whether Brexit will be a step forward for getting ecocide laws against ecocide, or the opposite.
And another question here at the back.
Fortunately, also the last question. Yeah. There you go.
Hi, I was wondering about if ecocide laws are implemented, how would you actually prosecute violators thereof? You mentioned the ICC, but not all countries are a member of the ICC, so I was wondering, maybe were you planning on establishing a tribunal for ecocide violators?
Alright, thank you. Sigis, would you like to answer maybe the last one first?
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, as you rightly point out, there are not all countries are signatories to the Rome Statute, which is the governing document for the International Criminal Court. There are, I think, 123 countries that are signatories. So the whole of Europe we are signatories. For instance, small island developing states, half of them are signatories. America is not a signatory, for instance, Canada is. So we have a block, if you like, of countries there. Where do you start? Well, there's a start, 123 countries. They're the ones that actually will be the ones that will have a say on whether or not this is proposed and then adopted as an amendment to the Rome Statute. But also, there's a process that can be gone through to become a signatory. When you're a small island developing state and you're going underwater, and this is a law that might help you, and you're not a signatory, you may then want to consider becoming a signatory. And actually the process to become a signatory isn't that cumbersome. And in fact, I even asked the question about that to the Coalition for the International Criminal Court last year, just how long and how much would it take for a small island state to become a signatory? And that's based on GDP. Small island developing states don't have such large GDPs as, say, the Netherlands, and the average fee for a small island state is €1,000. That's not that much, is it?
Would you agree,
Become
Mr.
signatories.
Spier?
So numbers can be improved.
Which statement are you talking about?
Well, yes.
Quite a lot has been said.
Right. But
Okay, so you agree with what Mrs. Higgins just said?
Well, if that is your conclusion.
let's move first to the TTIP question, where law is also being used against states or to actually be able to, for example, invest in tar sands. With the question around TTIP, he's over there. Could you, one of you, respond to that one? Ms. Higgins, I think it was directed to you.
Well, there's a hierarchy of law here, and if you look at the hierarchy of law, you have national laws, then you have international laws, and out of those international laws as well, then you have international criminal law. So, for instance, in our country, say our Prime Minister David Cameron decided that he wanted to gas a whole load of activists who were getting annoyed about Ecocide law or fracking. He couldn't do that. Well, he could do it, but he would be indicted for genocide, if you like. He could argue, well, now that we've got TTIP in place, all I'm doing is I'm making sure that those industry interests are not fettered, that they can continue with it. But what I'm trying to explain to you is that within this hierarchy of law, international crime stands above these bilateral, multilateral treaties. And that's very important here, because at the moment with TTIP, what you're seeing is essentially license for unfettered development, regardless of the harm it causes. But with an international crime of ecocide, what it's doing is saying, no, first of all, we have to address whether or not it's going to cause significant harm, whether or not it's going to cause ecocide. And only then can you go down that route. So this is very important because it acts as a kind of check and balance. It puts the stoppers on unfettered development per se, and it creates a context. It actually says, well, development is fine so long as it does not cause ecocide.
Right, and then the last question with regards if you know any...
Mr. Spier, would you like to comment on that?
Let me start saying I'm by no means in favor of fracking, by no means. But if that would mean that Mr. Cameron would be prosecuted, that would be the end of the ICC.
I'm not saying that he's going to go and gas a whole number of factors, but I was using that as an example to show the hierarchy of law. And of course, David Cameron would never in a million years think of gassing individuals. But 75 years ago, it actually wasn't that uncommon, and various countries had laws in place that made that lawful. And this is the beauty of international law. It actually changes our frame of reference of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And that is important in its own right. We do still have genocide playing out in certain countries, of course. But it's the exception, not the norm. And how do we change our frames of reference? Well, law plays a very important role in that, and especially criminal law, because actually it's when we take a moral wrong and make it a legal wrong. And Jaap, I'm sure you know this phrase, when malum in se becomes malum prohibita. It's a Latin phrase that's used in law. When something is so wrong in and of itself, we prohibit it. And that's really what ecocide law is addressing. There's something so wrong in and of itself to cause mass damage and destruction.
Then just a last question of that man, with regards if you know any initiatives on CO2 footprint.
No, footprint justice.
Footprint justice.
Wider scope of the planet.
Footprint justice, do you know any initiatives?
I don't. Do you?
Mrs. Spier? And else,
Well, in a sense, that's what we have tried to achieve, isn't it?
with your initiative?
In a
you know,
sense, yes.
By calculating the population.
Exactly.
So we can extend the Oslo Principles to the wider scope.
Please do. I will very much encourage it.
All right.
That's a nice goal to end with. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I think there's still a lot of to discuss. But next interview will be on Thursday with Shell, next week on Thursday, the 9th of June. It will be about the energy transition of Shell, and obviously we will ask them the question what their stance on are with Ecocide. We would like to welcome you then as well. But for now, please, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Jaap Spier and Polly Higgins.